The AOC Gaming U27G3X is an affordable 160Hz 4K gaming monitor with those fabled HDMI 2.1 ports. Indeed, it sports a 27-inch flat IPS panel with DisplayHDR 400 certification and adaptive sync technologies. At the time of filming, it can be found for roughly £500 in the UK and $450 in the US. In this video, which has been sponsored by the manufacturer, I'll be covering everything you need to know about it so that you can make your own informed purchasing decision. So jumping straight in, let's talk about its input lag. And yes, as you'll be able to see from this graph, I had it objectively tested at 0 milliseconds, which is absolutely spectacular for a 4K gaming monitor, giving you CRT-like performance, be it if you're on a console or indeed on a desktop computer. Now, what's equally important is the overall response time. And here there are a few different overdrive modes for you to get the best out of the monitor. There's off, weak, medium, strong, and the boost mode preset, which I'll be touching upon on the latter a little bit further down in this video. Now, using the OSRTD tool, you'll be able to see that at 160Hz, which is its maximum refresh rate, and also at 4K, you can see that with the overdrive set to off, the average initial time sat in at 6.04 milliseconds, which is what translates to average D to G, which is what manufacturers such as AOC often quote on their websites. Now, when it comes to the overdrive set to weak, it actually greatly improves. The average initial time drops down to 4.11 milliseconds and the percent in window becomes far more agreeable. You can see also the RGB overshoot is still very much minimal. Now, if you do want to get a little bit of that faster response time, you'll want to go on the medium preset. Here you can see that the RGB overshoot is becoming a little bit more apparent. However, the average initial time does drop down even further to 3.56 milliseconds. Now, there is also the strong mode preset with the average initial time dropping down to just 2.92 milliseconds. However, you will be able to note that the RGB overshoot becomes far less agreeable. Now, for me to demonstrate how the visual impact is, depending on the overdrive modes, you can see the UFO ghosting test. At 160Hz, you can see between off and medium, it's pretty acceptable. However, on the strong mode preset, you can see a little bit of inverse ghosting, specifically towards the darker shades. Now, there is also the boost mode preset, which effectively is the maximum MBR setting, in other words, motion blur reduction. And you'll be able to see over here that the UFO becomes a lot clearer, and therefore giving you a much better motion clarity. So it's something that you might want to utilize. However, this will limit you in terms of the overall peak brightness that the monitor can achieve. Now, of course, this is a console-centric monitor, so it would be criminal not to test it at 120Hz and 60Hz. Now, first off, at 120Hz, you can see that the average initial time with the overdrive set to off sits at 5.76 milliseconds. As we go over to weak, this drops down to 3.98 milliseconds. And then if we go on to the medium setting, it drops down to 3.47 milliseconds, while the RGB overshoot does become a little bit more noticeable. However, it's not as noticeable on the strong mode preset, because here you can see that the average initial time drops down to 2.92 milliseconds. Yes, indeed, there's a lot more error on the RGB overshoot table. Now, moving over to 60Hz and with the overdrive set again to off, you can see the average initial time sits at 5.67 milliseconds. While going on to the weak mode preset, this drops down to 4.5 milliseconds. And then going on to the medium preset, this drops down to 3.95 milliseconds. And finally on the strong mode preset, which again is not recommended, be it at 160Hz, 120Hz, or indeed 60Hz, sits at 3.46 milliseconds. Now, here you'll be able to see that via the UFO ghosting test that the overall visual impact on the strong mode overdrive is not something that you'll actually want to incur. And therefore, I would highly suggest going on the weak or the medium preset depending on the game you're playing. If it's a bit more hardcore gaming, maybe go for the medium setting and therefore have a little bit of that inverse ghosting. If, however, you want to negate it altogether but have an impact in terms of the overall response time, go for the weak mode preset. Now, you can see over here that the boost mode preset, in other words MBR, is present at 120Hz. However, it is not present at 60Hz. So there's just something worth considering that, very much like other monitors out there on the market, you will not be able to use motion blur reduction at 60Hz. Now, equally, motion blur reduction cannot be used simultaneously with adaptive sync technologies, in other words AMD FreeSync or NVIDIA G-Sync. Now, given this monitor does not have a native G-Sync module, it will have a VR range from 48 up to 160 Hz. Of course, if you're on console, it'll be going up to 120 Hz. Now here I was able to run the NVIDIA Pendulum demo while connected over DisplayPort or HDMI thanks to the 2.1 standard supporting VRR, and therefore didn't incur any sort of black screen issues or flickering. Better still, I was able to go in a game such as Destiny 2 while running HDR, and thus simultaneously running 4K 160Hz with NVIDIA G-Sync and also HDR, all working in tandem without any issues whatsoever. Now this was when connected over DisplayPort, but I also incurred the same sort of experience while running over HDMI. However, this was capped at up to 144Hz on PC, and of course will be capped at 120Hz while running on console. Now yes, you have got those HDMI 2.1 ports, which therefore gives you VRR support with consoles, but also gives you the full bandwidth of 4K at 120Hz, which will very much be appreciated for console gamers. On that note, you can also run this monitor at lower resolutions, such as 1440p or 1080p at a variety of different refresh rates. I could see it via my NVIDIA control panel on my computer, and I could only imagine that on a console you'll be also able to select between the different refresh rates. Of course here you will only have 120 and 60Hz to select from. Now aside from all of this, I would just like to highlight that when you are using adaptive sync technologies, you will notice that the low input lag mode is grayed out, but thankfully is on the on position. And therefore means that if you're going to be using AMD FreeSync or NVIDIA G-Sync technologies, you will be pleased to know that low input lag mode has actually been enabled. And therefore I didn't actually incur any sort of input lag while running said technologies. Equally, while running at 60Hz, I also noted that the low input lag mode was also grayed out, aside from of course the MBR setting which I referenced before. Now for those paying attention, you would have noticed that I mentioned HDR. And yes indeed, this monitor does accept an HDR signal. It's HDR10 compliant and has also got DisplayHDR 400 certification. Therefore we'll get to up to 400 nits in terms of peak brightness. Now this means that if you're going to be playing certain games, such as let's say Destiny 2, you'll be able to benefit from a high dynamic range. The overall color accuracy is actually pretty good in HDR. However, it is worth considering that due to the limitations of the overall brightness of this monitor, it's not going to give you a lifelike HDR reproduction, unlike some other monitors out there, including from ones that are offered from AOC that have got HDR 600 or above certification. So with gaming out of the way, what about when it comes to image quality? Well, here it has got a 27-inch 4K panel that runs up to 160Hz with a matte coating to it. It also has an IPS panel, therefore giving you fantastic viewing angles. And also, due to the overall form factor and resolution, you're getting a very high pixel density of 163. Now, with all of that in mind, there is also a dedicated sRGB mode that you can select via the monitor's OSD. This will, however, lock the overall brightness. Now, in said mode, I had it tested via my calibrators with a gamut coverage of 96.7% and a gamut volume of 100.3%. Below, you can see how it compares to the sRGB standards. As for the average ΔE and maximum ΔE, they sit at 1.43 and 4.46 respectively. The tested contrast ratio clocked in at 988:1, while the measured white point in comparison to the 6504 Kelvin target sat at 6238 Kelvin at 100%. As for the gamma curve, it sets relatively close to the 2.2 standard. Now for those who are not image editors or video graders, you might want to go outside of the sRGB color space, because it will give you a little bit of extra pop from the monitor. And here, on all the other modes, you will have a wider color gamut. Now I selected the warm mode preset, and here via my calibrators I noticed a positive increase in the gamut coverage and gamut volume. Here I was testing against the Adobe RGB standard, which clocked in at 84.3% and 92.3% respectively. Below you can see how it compares to the color space. As for the average ΔE and maximum ΔE, they are affected, and this note is against the Adobe RGB standard, sitting at 2.6 and 7.7 respectively. The tested contrast ratio does not change, however the measured white point does slightly shift at 6372 Kelvin at 100%, and equally so does the gamma curve. So aside from color performance, what about when it comes to your overall brightness? Well, here in HDR I clocked in a peak of 484 nits, while in SDR it's still pretty impressive at 449 nits, and therefore will suffice even if you are in a bright room. Now on that note, the sRGB brightness is locked to 249 nits, while the boost mode brightness, and therefore while running MBR in the maximum setting, will reduce this and lock it to 122 nits. As for its minimum brightness, it sits at a pretty high 108 nits. Now there is also the overall brightness uniformity, which I appreciate is somewhat panel lottery, so here you'll be able to see how my tested panel actually performed across the board. In terms of the overall backlight bleed, this is also another thing that you should be bearing in mind, specifically while looking at an IPS panel, which of course this AOC monitor does indeed use. Here you can see how it performs in a completely pitch black room while the brightness was cranked up at 100%. And note there is no local dimming option, be it in SDR or HDR. So past all these tests, let's talk about build quality, and here it's got a 3-side borderless design with a relatively thin bottom bezel. It has got a black and red finish to it. The stand itself is triangular shaped and provides you a good degree of ergonomics. You've got height, tilt, pivot and swivel adjustment. In fact, the monitor can be rotated in both directions, showing good sort of versatility. If of course you want to replace the monitor stand, you can do so via VESA compatible stand. Now the monitor itself does not have any built-in speakers. However, it does have a 3.5mm audio jack, allowing you to output audio when you plug in your headphones directly into the monitor. You can control the volume settings via the OSD. Speaking of which, over here, the OSD is accessed via a set of physical buttons found at the bottom right-hand side of the monitor, where the OSD itself is very comprehensively laid out and intuitive to use. It's also very responsive and therefore will be very easy for those people who are flicking between certain different settings, such as for example the overdrive modes that I referenced before. Now finally, I would like to point out that there are 2 DisplayPort 1.4 inputs and 2 HDMI 2.1 ports, which will also give you adaptive sync technologies over said input. Now using my desktop computer while connected over DisplayPort, I noticed 4K at 160Hz with 10-bit. Note this monitor has got a native 8-bit plus FRC technology, and over HDMI are noted up to 144Hz. However, with the 120Hz mode selected via the OSD, it of course went up to 120Hz at 4K. So there we have it. Hopefully this informative video has given you everything you need to know about the AOC Gaming U27G3X. I'd be curious to know what you make of this 4K gaming monitor down in the comment section below. And of course, if you have appreciated this video, make sure you drop a like, subscribe and hit that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.